How done it? Locked room murders and other impossible crimes, a subgenre of the genre we're here to celebrate today. Every great magic trick consists of 3 acts. First act is called the pledge. The magician shows you something ordinary, but of course it isn't. It probably isn't. The second with the twists and the turns, where lives hang in the balance and you see something shocking you've never seen before. That is a quote, some of you will know, from a script of a film called The Prestige, based on a novel by Christopher Priest. The pledge, the turn, and the prestige, the 3 acts of any great magic trick, combined with the central rule of magic, that what is seen is not what is actually being done. These also constitute the key ingredients of a successful impossible crime. Perhaps I should take a moment to explain what I mean by an impossible crime. So, sticking with the analogy of magic and illusions, I think there are 4 main kinds of impossible crime. Appearances, where something or someone appears or is created out of nothing. Disappearances, the exact opposite. Transformation, where something or someone is changed into something or someone else in impossible circumstances. And then the last category, other defiance of natural laws, which covers just about everything else that might be considered impossible. Now, the best known example of impossible crime is the locked room murder, a corpse discovered in a locked room from which apparently there are no means of escape, a box, a murder victim without apparently a murderer. And we aren't, of course, talking exclusively about locked rooms, a room, that is, with 4 walls, a ceiling and a floor, a room in a house. Locked room murders, like impossible crimes, can happen almost anywhere you care to think of, from swimming pools and prisons to museums and motel rooms. And instead of locked rooms, there have been locked submarines, locked spaceships, even, dare I say it, locked libraries. Now, locked room murders, like impossible crimes, can also be categorized. Types of a locked room murder. I bet you didn't think you were going to see a slide like this. In 1935, one of America's greatest writers of detective stories, John Dixon Carr, who was responsible for the radio play, identified 2 major classes of murder committed in a locked or hermetically sealed room. Please don't ask what hermetically sealed means, because I've never found that out. First class, murder, where the room is really hermetically sealed and from which no murderer has escaped because no murderer was actually in the room when the murder was committed. And the second main class, a murder where the room is not in fact hermetically sealed and for which there is in fact some more or less obvious means of escape. That's a picture of John Dixon Carr. Now, Carr's good friend, the American magician and crime writer Clayton Rawson, identified one further class of locked room murder. A murder where the room is really hermetically sealed and from which no murderer has escaped, because when the locked room is entered, the murderer is still in the room, but hidden in some more or less obvious place. Impossible crimes, and in particular locked room murders, have long been a staple of detective stories, with some writers like Carr and Rawson specialising in this kind of tale. The earliest locked room crime in detective fiction dates from the 1840s, but the oldest recorded impossible crime can be found in the Bible. In the book of Judges, where King Eglon of Moab is killed with a sword which cannot be found, because the assassin has pushed it into the king's enormous belly and the fat has closed over the top of it. I'm not kidding, it's in the book of Judges. So all puzzles stimulate interest, that's their purpose. And in trying to resolve a seemingly impenetrable problem, one may devise a different solution. And it seems likely to me that at least some locked room puzzles have originated because somebody, trying to unravel a riddle in a detective story, has discovered that his or her brilliant solution was not in fact the one devised by the author. There have even been impossible crimes in real life, mysteries that have challenged the police and the public and which remain unsolved to this day. The disappearance in 1809 of a British diplomat, Benjamin Bathurst, who walked around his carriage and simply vanished. In 1929, the shooting of Isidore Fink, should be memorable for that only, whose body was found in a locked room with no apparent means of escape. And in 1937, a woman called Laetitia Toureau was stabbed on the Paris metro in impossible circumstances. It's perhaps not surprising that solutions to these and many other unsolved real-life impossible crimes have also been produced as fiction. Around the start of the 20th century, there were many stories featuring impossible crimes, in particular the Father Brown stories of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton, you've heard mention of earlier. They also appear in the work of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the Dr. Thorndyke series by Richard Austin Freeman, to name just a few. But it was the 1930s that was very much the golden age of the impossible crime novel, with title after title in which ingenious writers presented ever more extraordinary problems for their ingenious detectives and readers to solve. One of my favourites from this period, often cited as the greatest locked room puzzle of them all, is by John Dickson Carr, who I mentioned earlier. In The Hollow Man, have people read The Hollow Man? Yeah, okay. Some haven't. If you haven't, you should. In The Hollow Man, which is called The Three Coffins in the United States, a witness sees a man let somebody into his study and close and lock the door. And the witness continues to observe the door until a shot is heard from the study a few minutes later. When the locked door is broken down, the man is found dying from a gunshot wound. But the stranger is missing. There is no sign of any weapon, and the ground below the only window and the roof above it are covered with unbroken snow. And there isn't a maniac with a lasso on the adjoining balcony. That's only one of the problems that Carr presents in the novel, which also includes a locked room lecture in which Carr's detective, Dr. Gideon Fell, describes the many ways in which such puzzles can be worked, and he provides a thorough analysis of the methods used in crime fiction so far. Carr is unquestionably the maestro of the impossible crime. As his biographer put it, he is the man who explained miracles. He even created one before the end of the Second World War, in which none other than the architect of that conflict himself, Adolf Hitler, was found dead in a locked room. As it was within a locked room, or at least locked bunker, that Hitler's body was in fact found after the fall of Berlin, I think we can be certain that Carr must at least have been taken in for questioning by the Allied forces. I think we can equally be very certain that he would have been able to prove to the investigating team that he couldn't possibly have done it, and that the crime was in fact impossible. Before I move away from Carr, I'm just going to say that the premier small press publisher of short stories and other mysteries from writers of the Golden Age, Crippen and Landru in America, is actually going to publish the complete set of plays from that series that we heard earlier, Cabin B13, most of which have not been heard in over 50 years, apart from the 2 or 3 that are on YouTube. Oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to mention that. Another great impossible crime book from the 1930s forms The American Gun Mystery by Ellery Queen. Anyone read that? Okay, a few readers there. Ellery Queen was a writing partnership of 2 American cousins. Now, in this novel, a man is murdered in the middle of a sports arena. But despite searching the stadium and everybody in it, no weapon can be found. And another one of my own favourites is Hercule Poirot's Christmas, in which the greatest crime writer of them all, Agatha Christie, reprises the main elements of her most famous novel and tasks her Belgian detective Hercule Poirot with explaining how a man was killed in a room that no one was seen to leave and in which no one but the victim was found. There were published in the 1930s many, many other wonderful books featuring some truly ingenious locked room puzzles. As well as the giants of detective fiction like Christie, Carr and Queen, incredible problems were devised by less well-known writers like Philip MacDonald and Hake Talbot, whose novel Rim of the Pit is quite simply a tour de force with a whole basket of miracles. And I should make clear that impossible crimes were very far from being an Anglo-Saxon curiosity. Noel Vandry, among other French writers, produced a dozen locked room puzzles in the 1930s, all with something to merit attention. In fact, during the 1930s, there were so many novels featuring impossible crime that by 1941, in a celebrated essay on the rules of the game, writing detective fiction, the eminent American critic Howard Haycraft urged beginners in the genre to avoid the locked room puzzle, because, he went on, only a genius can invest it with any novelty or interest today. Now, we have to take Howard Haycraft very seriously, because he invented the phrase, the Golden Age, even though he got the dates wrong. So clearly, Howard Haycraft recognised that for every great locked room puzzle of this period, there were countless poor ones, with an often sensational turn and pledge, a genuinely entrancing setup and a truly baffling illusion, but sadly a simply abysmal prestige. Titles like Trackless Death by Armstrong Livingston. Has anyone read that? No, and even if you had, you wouldn't admit it. in which a man's body is discovered with multiple injuries in the middle of a muddy field, which bears no tracks. And it is eventually revealed that the murderer had positioned the body in the field without leaving any tracks in the mud by using a giant catapult. Another is the Lestrange case by John Bentley, in which a man is strangled during a séance while all in the room are holding hands. And the murderer is eventually shown to be a trained chimpanzee who came and went via a dumb waiter. Now, to be fair, the identification of an animal as the murderer is not always a bad idea. The solution to the Lestrange case is very similar to the solution of the very first locked room murder to appear in fiction, Edgar Allan Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue, published in 1841. I'm not going to ask because I know lots of people would have read that. That, incidentally, is also generally accepted as the first genuine detective story. Even great writers could come up with very poor impossible crimes. The eminent novelist Eden Philpotts, who inspired a young Agatha Christie, wrote a book called The Marylebone Miser, in which the victim is stabbed in a locked room, and the solution? The knife had been attached to a piece of string which allowed the murderer to throw it through a narrow opening, then pull it out of the wound and back out through the narrow opening. Now, many of these weaker entries fall foul of the unwritten golden rule of impossible crimes, which is simply that unless the impossible crime has arisen accidentally, for example because of an unexpected chain of events, there must be a rational reason why the criminal decided that the circumstances of the crime should be presented in such a way as to suggest impossibility. If a murder victim is found in a locked room, then there has to be a reason why the murderer needed that to happen. All the best impossible crimes and locked room puzzles obey that rule. Good. I've got myself in a little tangle here. The weakest ones don't. The weakest ones are often quite ridiculous, and the convoluted explanations often come as a significant letdown. I've given you some examples, but trust me, these are far from being the worst. So, to return to Howard Haycraft, did young writers heed his advice and avoid trying to devise new impossible crimes? Did the locked room puzzle fade away, as Haycraft implied it would? Well, after 1941, while relatively few new novelists came to the fore with new puzzles, those who had already nailed their colours to the mast continued to intrigue and beguile. John Ditson Carr continued until the 1970s, and Anthony Wynne, whose Dr. Haley novels started in the 1920s, they continued until the 1950s. And throughout the second half of the 20th century, many Golden Age writers, including Niall Marsh, Christiana Brand, Edmund Crispin, novels like The Case of the Gilded Fly, to name but a few, continued to devise novel problems and ingenious solutions. In France, the same thing was going on. In Japan, Akimitsu Tagaki produced a dozen novels featuring impossible crimes, including the Tattoo Murder Case, which is a quite fascinating mystery set in occupied Japan. In France, there were several extremely satisfying locked room murders devised by Pierre Boyot and Pierre Hérault, better known as the crime-writing partnership Boyot-Narcejac, on whose work were based two of the greatest mystery films, Hitchcock's Vertigo and Clouseau's Les Diaboliques. In the short story form, locked room murders and impossible crimes were simply everywhere, with writers on both sides of the Atlantic and around the world constructing new riddles. And many of these have been collected in anthologies of impossible crime stories. I'm thinking of writers like the phenomenally prolific Edward D. Hoke, the masterly Arthur Porge, and Joseph Commings, whose short story collection Banner Deadlines is hugely entertaining. Those are some really good anthologies. And these are books by the people I've just mentioned. Now, impossible crimes have also remained very popular in the visual form too, with films like Flight Plan, Jodie Foster, Fracture, Anthony Hopkins, and on the small screen in series like Jonathan Creek, produced for BBC Television, in which the writer David Rennick presented some truly extraordinary problems, a murderer who is seen walking through snow yet leaves no tracks, or a kidnapper who disappears from within a locked garage, surrounded on all sides, while dressed as a skeleton. And another episode, and most recently, features a haunted room from which people have been vanishing during the night for decades. Now, while recent episodes of Jonathan Creek have generally been distinctly poor, the series was at its best sublime, and some of the riddles easily the equal of classics of the Golden Age. There's also the wonderful series Sherlock by Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss, which is soon to return, thankfully, to our screens. Sherlock has also featured numerous impossible crimes, not least the puzzle of how Sherlock could fall to his death and yet not die. Personally, I didn't find the explanation for that at all satisfactory, but there we are. And impossible crimes have also featured on American television in series like Psych and the soon-to-end CSI Las Vegas. And two major American series have been devoted almost exclusively to impossible crimes. In the 1970s, there was a series called Banachek. People remember that? No, okay. In which an unpopular Polish-American detective played by George Peppard solved various insurance problems involving disappearing works of art and vanishing vehicles. One of the worst in that was a huge statue which was a balloon. It was just awful. More recently, there has been Monk. People familiar with Monk?
Yes.
Okay. Best classic detective story series since Columbo, I think. Monk features a former detective suffering from obsessive-compulsive disorder whose heart and head and the crimes he solves are very much from the Golden Age. And if you haven't seen Tony Shalhoub in Monk, you really should buy the box set. You will not regret it. Of course, when analysed, the problems presented in many, if not all, of these modern puzzles do often have the same solution as an earlier puzzle, but the delight comes from the pledge and the turn, how the impossible crime has been set up by the writer, which mean that, as with the audience of a modern conjurer, even the most experienced reader of detective stories is often unable to detect the trick being played out in front of them. So what of the future? After all, can there really be any solutions left that nobody's thought of? Will the locked room puzzle eventually disappear? I personally don't believe so. We seem to be living in an age where murder is actually frighteningly easy, an age of endless war where killings on and off the battlefield account for most of the headlines, in a world where it seems that, to paraphrase the Bible, terrorists will always be with us, as George Orwell predicted. So real murder is pretty easy. And that's precisely why I believe Golden Age mysteries generally are becoming popular once again, and why I believe that impossible crimes and the locked room murders that were such a staple of the Golden Age will remain firm favourites. These are stories where, instead of being easy, murder is difficult. And as I've said, doubtless old puzzles, like old illusions, will continue to appear, not least in historical settings where forensic science was less advanced, or in settings where modern techniques are less readily available, like the fictional island of Saint Marie in Robert Thorogood's entertaining Death in Paradise television series. But impossible crimes can also work in a modern urban setting, one outstanding example being the Tokyo Zodiac Murders. People are familiar with that? By Soji Shimada. It's a very good book, worth looking at. So to conclude, there are two main reasons why I'm confident that the locked room puzzle is very far from having run its course. First, as I've said, there are many new writers who will continue to find new ways to hocus locks or to vanish people or weapons. Second, there are a small number of enterprising publishers, like the British Library and HarperCollins, as well as small publishers like Crippen and Laundrie that I've mentioned, and another American publisher, Locked Room International, who are reprinting classic English, American, and other foreign language impossible crime novels, like The Mystery of the Yellow Room, The Big Bow Mystery, the Sam Hawthorne series of stories by Ed Hoke, which are set in New England, and the fascinating short story collection Night of the Wolf by a French writer called Paul Halter. However, I therefore think that the grandest part of the grandest game in the world, writing and reading detective stories, will go on forever. However, I can't end without saying a few words about the unquestioned expert on locked room murders and impossible crimes. For those who don't know, I'm referring to Robert Adey, a good husband to Sue, and a good friend and companion to many, including some in this room. Sadly, Bob died earlier this year, and if you really want to learn more about how locked room murders have been perpetrated over the years, or to read some classic examples, then I thoroughly recommend Bob's comprehensive study, which is called, perhaps not surprisingly, Locked Room Murders. There are also several short story mystery anthologies that Bob co-edited with other experts, Death Locked In, Murder Impossible, Van der Fiel Impossible, and 18 locked room puzzles. I'm glad I didn't have to read that in Japanese. Quite simply, Bob Adey knew all there was to know about the art of the impossible, and it really should have been him rather than me who spoke to you today. Thank you. So we have got a little bit of time for any questions before I hand over to Dolores. Any questions?
I was wondering what your opinion was on, there's a few books where it describes locked room murders, but they're only, I actually hesitate to name them, one by Ellery Queen, for example, but they're only locked for impossible for one suspect. And so by the very description actually gives away who the killer is. I mean, I can't really go into more detail on that, but I guess back to spoiling the book. But do you think that counts as locked room murders? Or?
I think sometimes that's a very fair criticism, that the reason the locked room, the impossible crime has been set up is to give one person an alibi. So you work out who the one person is who's got an alibi as a result of the locked room, you've probably got the murderer. It's a little bit like with Agatha Christie. People always say she picked the least likely suspect. Actually, she picked the most likely suspect every single time. You just got fooled. And that, I think, is where a really good writer can get over the problem of having structured the plot around making one person, giving one person an alibi, and befuddle you with so many other details that you've got a rather richer mystery, and perhaps you take your eye off the ball and you forget to focus on it. But you're absolutely right. With many, many impossible crimes, stop and think, who's the person who this helps most?